The dust hadn't settled when the Riverview post wagon creaked to a stop. June stepped down before the driver could offer a hand, her boots hitting the dry ground with a muted thud. She didn't ask questions, just looked around, at the empty street, the boarded-up saloon, and the cracked watering trough that hadn't seen a horse in days. It wasn't what she'd expected. She adjusted her grip on the single leather case she'd packed. 5 dresses, a photograph, and one folded letter that had been read so many times it tore at the crease. Then she saw the poster. Wanted for bank robbery, his face. The same face from the photograph. The same man she'd written to, waited for. Promised to marry. A voice behind her broke the silence. "Miss, if you're looking for Silas Reed, I'm afraid you're a few weeks too late." She turned. An old man stood near the post wagon, hat in hand, eyes kind. "I'm just the post. I don't write the news, I only deliver it." June said nothing, just turned her eyes toward the distant hills, where Riverview Ranch waited, and where no one else was going. But she would. June didn't ask for directions. She didn't ask who had last seen Silas Reed, or why no one had taken down the wanted poster stapled to the post outside the mercantile. She didn't ask because deep down, she already knew. If he was guilty, she would have to learn to live with that. And if he wasn't, well, the truth would come when it came. She stepped off the main street and began walking toward Riverview Ranch. The case in her hand was heavier than it had felt that morning. Or maybe she just hadn't noticed the weight until everything else had started to sink. The postman had tried to say something else, about how Silas wasn't a bad man, how things weren't always what they seemed. But June had already turned away. She didn't need apologies or vague warnings. She needed answers. And if she couldn't find them in town, she'd find them where the letters had come from, the ranch. It was a half-day walk under a flat sun. The wagon road twisted through dry grass and brittle fence lines. No horses, no cattle, just the wind and a few vultures circling something unseen. She kept going. The first thing she saw was the barn. It sagged to one side like it was too tired to stand. The paint had long since peeled away, revealing gray wood with veins like old hands. The house came into view a moment later, a simple 2-room structure with one shutter swinging open, caught in the breeze. June stopped at the gate. The sign was still there. Riverview Ranch carved in bold letters. But no one was watching the view now. No smoke from the chimney, no dogs barking, no boots on the porch. The silence was thick, broken only by the wooden creak of the porch swing, shifting in the breeze. She didn't hesitate. She opened the gate. The latch was stiff. She had to push hard to make it give. And when she did, the sound echoed like a challenge into the empty yard. She crossed the distance with steady steps. When she reached the door, she paused only long enough to knock once. Out of habit, not expectation. Then she turned the knob and walked inside. The air smelled of dust and disuse. The kitchen table still had a cup on it, dry and empty. A coat hung by the door. One boot was missing its pair. There were no signs of a struggle, no overturned chairs. Just a house frozen in the middle of someone leaving and never coming back. She set her suitcase down beside the table and walked to the window. The curtains were thin, and the fabric had been eaten at the corners by moths. Outside, the barn doors hung open. Tools leaned against the wall, untouched. The troughs were dry. She didn't cry. Instead, she opened the back door and stepped onto the porch. The view was what the ranch was named for, a long stretch of low hills rolling toward the horizon, golden, wind-tossed and wide. A place meant for someone to build something in, or to escape to, maybe both. She took a breath, and then, with sleeves rolled up and jaw set, she walked back inside. She had work to do. But first she stood still, one hand on the door frame, the other brushing the windowsill, coated thick with time and forgetfulness. The silence in the house wasn't hostile, it was waiting, and she knew somehow that if she didn't move soon, it would consume her too. So she started with the dust. She swept the floors like she was chasing ghosts out of hiding, beat the rugs until her arms ached, opened every window like it might let some of her own breath out too. Found a well out back, barely usable, but deep enough to bring up a bucket of clean water. She boiled it, scrubbed the table, and stacked the dishes she found under the sink. There was no pantry to speak of, but she located a small bag of flour, some stale oats, and a can of peaches. Enough for a day or two. In a chest under the bed, she found more than she expected. 3 shirts, 2 clean blankets, and a stack of letters. Not hers. These were older, folded carefully, addressed to names she didn't recognize. Some were unopened, some were creased with heavy wear. She didn't read them. She closed the chest, returned the blanket to the bed, and went back outside. By evening, the house no longer smelled empty. She lit the old stove, made a thin soup with what little she had, and sat on the porch with the bowl in her lap. The sun dropped fast, leaving a chill that crept up her arms. She didn't have a coat, but she didn't go inside. Not yet. She sat until the sky turned to ash and the coyotes began to call. And then finally she whispered aloud for the first time since arriving, "You should have been here." She didn't know if she meant it in anger or grief, but it was true either way. That night she slept in the bed that wasn't hers, in the house that didn't belong to her, waiting for a man who might never return. But she didn't feel like a guest. She didn't feel like someone passing through. She felt like someone who had arrived, and that somehow was enough. June woke before the sun crested the hills, her body stiff from the unfamiliar mattress, her arms aching from the previous day's labor. She didn't lie there and wait for warmth or clarity. She swung her legs over the edge of the bed, pulled on her boots, and started the day like someone who had been doing it alone for years. In truth, it had only been 4 days since she arrived at Riverview Ranch, but time bends when you're the only voice in a place. She fetched water from the well again, 2 buckets this time. The rope on the pulley had frayed further overnight, and she made a note to ask for new cord the next time she dared return to town. She boiled 1 bucket for cleaning and the other for drinking. While the stove groaned to life, she swept the porch, tied back the limp curtains, and checked on the coop. Only 1 chicken had survived, a mean old hen with missing feathers and a temper to match. It eyed June warily as she scattered crumbs from a stale biscuit into the dirt. "You're not much," she said, "but you're not dead. That's something." By mid-morning, she had patched the gap in the back fence, using a rusted hammer and nails she'd scavenged from a collapsed woodpile. She hadn't asked permission. There was no one to give it, but she still spoke aloud while she worked, narrating her actions like someone might be listening anyway. "Reckon this'll hold for now, least until the wind remembers how to behave." Sweat dampened the back of her neck. Dirt streaked her arms and skirt. She didn't stop. Not when the hammer split, not when her fingers bled, not even when the vultures circled low again, reminding her she was still alone on this land and no one was watching but the sky. That afternoon, she walked the perimeter of the property. It took nearly 2 hours, not because the land was large, it wasn't, but because she kept stopping. There were boot prints near the north fence that didn't match hers. Too large, too fresh. A cigarette butt, too. She didn't smoke. Silas might have, but he wasn't supposed to be here. She crouched and touched the disturbed soil, heart beating faster than she'd allow her face to show. Then she stood, turned, and walked back to the house like nothing had happened. Inside, she checked the rifle above the mantel. Unloaded, no ammunition. She found 2 bullets in the kitchen drawer beneath a bent fork and a spool of thread. She loaded them slowly, not because she expected danger, but because it was worse not to be ready. She slept that night with the rifle beside the bed. She didn't expect sleep to come, and when it did, it came thin and broken, like a fence missing too many boards. The house creaked in places it hadn't before. Wind touched the windows like a stranger trying to knock without making a sound. At one point, she sat up. Not because of noise, because silence had gotten too loud. She reached out and touched the rifle again, just to make sure it was still there, just to remind herself that she still was too. She closed her eyes again, one open, no dreams. The next morning, the postman returned. He didn't come all the way to the porch, just stopped by the gate and tipped his hat like he knew how far was too far. "Morning, miss," he called. June came out with her sleeves rolled and a kitchen towel in one hand. "Morning. I figured I ought to check in. Word spread that you're still here." "I live here," she said. He hesitated. "You sure you want that to be true?" June didn't blink. "I'm not waiting on Silas. I'm building what he left behind." The postman scratched his cheek. I don't know what he did or didn't do. I just know people say things. Let them. He seemed relieved by her steadiness, or afraid of it. She couldn't tell. Before he left, he pulled something from his satchel. A small bundle of letters, some unopened. Found these in the back office, he said. Some look like his hand. She took them without flinching. Thank you. When he was gone, she sat at the table and spread the letters out. Only 2 had her name on them. The rest were addressed to others. Business partners, a sister in Missouri, a name she didn't recognize but suspected was a former partner in whatever dealings had led to that wanted poster. She opened the first letter slowly. Silas's handwriting was neat, upright, his words careful. He wrote about the ranch needing work, about building a life, about wanting someone who would stay even if things weren't easy. She folded it back into the envelope and didn't touch the second one. Not yet. 3 days passed before another soul came up the road. This time a woman, older, rigid, wrapped in a bonnet and a black shawl like she was attending a funeral. You June? She asked from atop a creaky wagon. I am. I'm Edna. I run the mercantile. Heard you came for Silas. I came for the life he promised, June said, but I'm staying for the one I'm building. Edna studied her, expression unreadable. Then she lifted a small bag from the wagon bed and set it on the gatepost. Flour? On credit. Don't make me regret it. June gave a polite nod. I won't. When Edna left, June watched the dust settle on the road behind her, and for the first time she felt something close to permission. She used the flour that night to bake flatbread. It didn't rise, but it filled her. And that was all she needed. Word traveled fast in towns like Riverview. The following afternoon, she walked into town with her sleeves rolled and her hair tied back in a scarf. The mercantile was half full. Edna greeted her with a glance. 2 women by the sugar barrel fell silent as she passed. Mail order bride, one of them whispered, and he's a criminal. June didn't stop walking. She didn't react. She simply picked up a spool of twine, a tin of coffee, and a box of nails. She set them on the counter and counted out her coins slowly, precisely. As she turned to leave, she paused. Then clearly and calmly she said, I may have come here with a letter, but I'm not waiting on a man to give me a name. The store was silent. Edna didn't flinch. The other women looked away. She walked out taller than she'd walked in. That night someone left a note wedged under the barn door. No envelope, no name. Just 5 words. He's not coming back, girl. June read it once, folded it carefully, and tucked it into her journal between pages smeared with dirt and penciled inventory. Then she walked to the field, stood beneath the moon, and whispered, He doesn't need to. The wind stirred the tall grass. Something rustled beyond the ridge. She didn't move. She just stood there, rifle across her chest, boots planted in soil she'd begun to believe might one day be hers. And for the first time since arriving, she smiled. The air that morning smelled of sage and old rain. Not because it had rained, Lord knew it hadn't in weeks, but because the sky finally looked like it remembered how. Gray clouds tugged across the ridge, low and mean, promising something they might not deliver. June stood by the paddock with a tin cup in her hand, staring into the wind like it had answers. The chicken, still alive and still angry, scratched near her boots. She'd started naming things, even if she never said the names aloud. The chicken was Commander. The old maple by the well was Elias. The shovel with the cracked handle was Missouri, after the place she'd left behind and never meant to see again. Naming was dangerous. Naming meant staying, and staying meant hope. She turned back toward the house, stepped up onto the porch just as a shape moved along the distant trail. A rider, alone. He didn't come fast, didn't wear the urgency of someone running from something, but not the confidence of someone invited either. June watched, unmoving, as the rider approached, slow and deliberate, his horse dark and tall beneath him. He wore a long coat, weather-worn and dust-coated, and a wide hat that shaded his face until he was nearly at the gate. He dismounted without speaking, didn't tie the horse, didn't call out. But he looked straight at her and said, quiet and clear, "You're June." Her hand found the edge of the doorframe. "You're trespassing." "I could be," he replied. She narrowed her eyes. You know Silas? He took off his hat then. His face was younger than she expected. 30, maybe less. But there was something in his eyes that made age hard to measure. I knew him. Knew. He paused. Still do. Sort of. She didn't move from the porch. What does that mean? It means he's not dead. Not yet. But he might be if you don't listen to what I came to say. The words didn't hit like a threat. They landed more like a warning. Still, she didn't flinch. I'm listening. He stepped forward, just enough for her to see the faint scar under his jaw. My name's Emery. I rode with Silas back when he had a crew. Her breath caught. You're an outlaw. No, ma'am, not anymore. I got smart. Silas didn't. Then why are you here? He took a breath. To tell you something I probably shouldn't. June didn't speak. Just let the wind fill the silence. He didn't rob that bank. I know. You think you know, Emery said, but I mean it. He took the fall for someone, and now he's rotting in a cell while the real bastard's still drinking whiskey with his boots on a porch like this one. June crossed her arms. Why are you telling me? Emery hesitated. Because Silas wrote me. Said if he didn't make it, I should come out here. Make sure you were okay. She didn't move from the threshold, just looked at him a long moment. Then finally, you're not here to hurt me. It wasn't a question, it was a decision. He shook his head once, solemn. No, ma'am, I'm not. She turned, opened the door wider. You can eat, but you don't stay. That's fair. Inside, the house was quiet, not empty, just holding its breath. June set a plate on the table without ceremony. No extra fork, no apology for the chipped cup. Just food, just heat, just a place to sit. Emery ate like a man who knew the value of silence, and June watched him like someone deciding if a man could carry truth without setting it down. Poured coffee into a chipped cup. Emery ate like someone used to silence, and she let him. When he finished, he stood, thanked her, and walked to the door. Before leaving, he said, You're stronger than he ever told me. She met his eyes. He doesn't know the half of it. Then he was gone. June stood there a long time, the pouch still heavy in her hand. She unfolded the note. It was short. If you're reading this, it means I failed. But if you're still there, then maybe I didn't. I never deserved you. But I hoped you'd come anyway. And if I ever get out, I'll come back the long way, so I'm worth arriving for. SR. She folded it again, placed it in the same drawer as the rest. Then she walked outside back to the fence. The wind had picked up again, but this time it didn't chill her. It carried, and she stood straighter against it than ever before, because now she knew. She hadn't come for a man. She had come for a future, and no matter what happened next, it would not find her waiting. June didn't tell anyone that a stranger had come to the ranch. She didn't mention the ring, or the note, or the name Emery had spoken in that low, even voice that sounded more like confession than warning. She folded the memory into her spine and carried it the way she carried everything else, alone, upright, and without complaint. The day after Emery left, the wind shifted. It wasn't the kind that stirred curtains or rattled shutters. It moved slower, heavier, full of something that made her stop mid-task and lift her head, listening for a sound that hadn't yet arrived. The chickens were quiet. Even Commander. The clouds crawled in from the west like they'd been summoned. June was digging a row for carrots when she heard the wagon. Not a gallop, not a threat, just the steady rhythm of wooden wheels against dry earth. She stood, wiping her hands on her skirt, and waited. The wagon came into view. Edna's again. This time with sacks in the back and a boy perched beside her, no older than 10, holding a box in his lap like it might bite. Morning, Edna called, stopping short of the gate. June nodded. Everything all right? Edna pointed to the box. Got chicks. Hatchlings. Found 'em cheap from a fella east of Copper Run. Thought you might want some. June blinked. She stepped forward and looked at the boy, who opened the lid slightly to reveal a puff of yellow movement and soft, urgent peeping. I don't have a proper coop yet, she said. Edna shrugged. Didn't say you needed one. Just said maybe the place needed more noise. June smiled despite herself. She took the box gently from the boy, who watched her like she was something halfway between outlaw and legend. Edna added, "Also brought rope and feed. You'll pay me when you can." June swallowed the words forming in her throat. "Why?" Edna tilted her head. "Because you stayed." The wagon rolled off without another word. That night, June sat on the porch with a chick asleep in the crook of her arm, and the wind lifting her hair like it had a right to touch her now. She watched the horizon darken with slow rain and whispered, "Silas, if you ever come home, you might not recognize the place." She didn't mean the land. She meant herself. 3 days later, a girl from town showed up with a question about canning tomatoes. June didn't know the answer, but she figured they'd learn together. 1 week after that, the pastor's wife came with a jar of lard and a note that said, "They say you've made something grow out there. I'd like to see it." June let her in. They talked for hours about bread and bees and how sometimes the land listens better than people do. The woman left with 2 carrots and a promise to return. June didn't say it aloud, but in her heart she knew. She wasn't a guest anymore. She belonged. Then the wind changed again, not in direction, but in purpose. It carried with it the thump of hooves. 3 horses, 3 riders. June stepped off the porch before the dust even settled. They came like a storm that hadn't made up its mind yet. Not fast, but full of tension. 3 riders, 3 shadows against the ridge, dust curling around their boots even before they dismounted. Except they didn't. They just sat there, watching her. The middle one, tall, pressed coat, silver belt buckle that didn't belong to work, tipped his hat like it was a weapon, not a courtesy. "You June?" he asked, voice slick and easy, like he thought the name might shrink when spoken aloud. She didn't step back, didn't lower her gaze. She just folded her arms and let the silence tighten between them. "We heard you were waiting on a man, Silas Reed." "Nothing about his tone," said neighbor. He looked past her to the porch swing, the tools by the fence, the neat rows in the garden, and that's when June understood. They weren't just there to ask questions. They were there to remind her who wasn't supposed to survive out here alone. She nodded. "We heard you were waiting on a man, Silas Reed." She didn't respond. "We just came from Dobbs Hollow. Word is, he's up for sentencing soon. But see, the thing is," he leaned slightly forward, "some folks think he might walk." June held his gaze. "And?" The man's smile didn't reach his eyes. "That'd be inconvenient for some of us." "Who's us?" He shrugged. "People with investments." June didn't flinch. "People with guilt?" The man's jaw tightened. "You keep that mouth sharp, and someone's gonna dull it for you." June stepped off the porch fully. Then they better come with more than a warning and dust on their boots. For a long beat, no one moved. Then one of the riders spit to the side. The lead man grunted. "Just letting you know the winds are shifting, miss." She didn't break eye contact. "Then I'll plant deeper." They rode off without another word. June watched them go until the sound of hooves faded into the hills. Then she turned back to the house, her heartbeat steady. She knew now. They weren't just afraid Silas would speak. They were afraid someone like her had stayed and built and lasted. That night, the wind carried rain. The roof leaked. She placed a bucket under the drip and sat beside it with her sewing. The chicks chirped softly in the next room. Commander slept on the hearth like she owned the place. And June, with a mug of bitter tea and the rifle leaned against the wall, let herself feel something she hadn't felt in months. Readiness, not for a fight, not for a storm, but for him, for Silas. If he came back, if he found his way, if justice bent in his favor. She'd be here, not waiting, just living. In the place he'd once promised, in the life she'd claimed, in a name she was no longer borrowing. The sun had just begun to slide behind the western ridge when June heard it, a sound that didn't belong to wind or chicken or the daily thump of her own boots on dry earth. It was hooves, not fast, not panicked, just steady. She wiped her hands on her apron and stepped outside, not rushing, not bracing, just opening herself to whatever the evening brought. The horse came into view around the edge of the barn. The rider didn't wear a badge, didn't wear shame either. He wore road dust and time and a gray shirt that once might have been blue, and when he saw her, He stopped. Completely. She didn't move. Not at first. Her hands, still dusted with flour from that morning's bread, hung motionless by her sides. The man in front of her looked like the photograph once folded in her suitcase, but also nothing like it. Thinner, older in the eyes, wearing miles and mistakes like layers no coat could cover. He didn't smile, didn't run to her, just stood there, hat in hand, like maybe the porch was a church and she was the confession. And still, she didn't speak, because the silence between them wasn't empty. It was full of the life she had built without him. He dismounted like a man not sure if the ground would still know his weight. And when he removed his hat, she saw it in his face. Not guilt, not fear, but ache, deep and quiet, like something that had been walking too long without water. "I wasn't sure you'd still be here," he said. "I wasn't sure you'd still be you," she replied. Silas's eyes dropped for a moment, then rose again. "I read every letter you sent." "I only sent two." He nodded. "I memorized both." A silence settled between them, as real and solid as the earth beneath their feet. June crossed her arms. "What did they do to you?" "They let me go," he said. "That's not what I asked." He looked past her for a second, toward the porch, toward the house. Her house now. "They took time," he said finally. "More than they had a right to." June nodded. "I took it back," she said. He looked at her sharply then. "What?" "This place. I took it back. From dust. From silence. From them. You left a name here. I made it a life." He stepped forward slowly. "June, I'm not the man I promised to be. I'm not the woman you wrote to." The words met in the air between them, full of truth, but not bitterness. He took another step. "You built all this." She nodded. "With the postman and the merchant's wife and a chicken named Commander, and no help from ghosts." He laughed softly, and then he went quiet. "Do I have a place in it?" She didn't answer. Instead, she walked past him, toward the barn. He followed. Inside, she pointed to the stall she'd cleared weeks ago. A rope, a brush, a place to lay. "It's not much," she said, "but it's clean, and you'll earn the rest." Silas set his bag down slowly. "I didn't come for comfort," he said. "I didn't build it for comfort," she replied. He looked at her then, really looked, and for the first time since he'd arrived, he saw not a bride, not a woman waiting, but someone who had chosen herself, and somehow that made him love her more. They didn't speak much that first evening. June made cornbread. Silas repaired the hinge on the back door. At dusk, he stood on the porch and watched the hills while she read by lamplight. And when he finally stepped back inside, he said quietly, "I left as one man. I've come back as another." She turned a page. "That's good," she said, "because the man who left didn't leave a place for me." He stepped closer. "I'd like to." June looked up. "Then don't promise it." He stilled. "Just show me." They slept in separate rooms. Not from fear, but from honesty. She needed to know that he'd walk beside her without asking her to shrink. And he needed to know that being needed was not the same as being wanted. The next morning, June found him in the garden, hands in the dirt, back to the rising sun. She brought him a cup of coffee and didn't say a word. He took it, brushed the soil from his fingers, and smiled. It was small, but it was real. And in that smile, she saw something she hadn't expected. A beginning that didn't come from a letter, but from the long road home. Silas didn't ask to take the reins. He rose before the sun, hauled water, repaired fence posts, and kept mostly to the edges of June's rhythm. He didn't touch her letters, didn't question the new layout of the kitchen, and didn't ask why there was a soft whistle nailed to the barn post marked Commander. He just did what needed doing. And June watched, not closely, not with suspicion, but with that quiet attention of someone who had learned long ago that words meant less than actions. She watched how he rubbed the horse's shoulder before saddling, how he paused at the garden gate each morning like it deserved respect, how he never tried to open her door unless she opened it first. And slowly, almost invisibly, the air changed again. Not like wind, like breath. The ranch began to speak differently. The porch groaned less at night. The hens laid more regularly. Even the soil seemed looser under her hands, like it too had stopped bracing for abandonment. The townspeople changed too. Edna started sending over extra sacks of flour without saying why. The pastor's wife dropped by with a note asking if June would consider helping teach the younger girls how to hold their ground. Even the girl from before, the one who asked about canning, returned not for tomatoes but to ask, "Is he really him?" June smiled softly. "He is, and he isn't." The girl tilted her head. "Is that good?" June looked out at the yard, where Silas knelt beside a fence post, hands deep in dirt. "It's enough." One evening, June stepped onto the porch and found a small package resting on the swing. No name, no note. Inside, a silver-handled hairbrush and a pair of gloves, neither expensive, but both well-made. She didn't need to ask who left them. She set them on the table and sat in the swing, letting it rock gently. Silas came up the steps a few minutes later, sweat on his brow, eyes cautious. "You saw?" "I did," he nodded. "I don't expect anything." "I know." He looked down. "But I want everything." She let the swing slow, then said quietly, "I spent months building something out of silence, out of wood and water and wind, something strong enough to carry me whether or not you ever came back." He met her gaze. "I see it," she nodded. "And if you're going to be here, you don't need to lead it." He didn't flinch. "I'll follow." She watched him for a moment. Then, without fanfare, she reached out her hand. He took it, and they stayed that way. No kiss, no vow, just hand in hand, in the home she'd built with no guarantee. Later that month, the rains returned, not in violent bursts, but soft, soaking waves that made the hills glow green again. June planted lavender along the fence line. Silas built a bench under the maple tree. They didn't speak much while they worked, but that was all right, because the silences between them were no longer full of absence. They were full of presence. In town, people stopped calling her the mail-order bride. She became Miss June of Riverview. And Silas? He became the man who knew how to listen. One evening, as dusk painted the sky with fire, Silas came in holding something behind his back. She was kneading bread. He said, "Got a question?" She didn't stop working the dough. "Go on then." He pulled a simple ring from behind his back. Old silver. Familiar. "Will you marry me?" She looked up, wiped her hands on a cloth, stepped around the counter, took the ring, and said, "You're already home." Then she kissed him. Not like a promise, but like a choice. Some folks say stories like theirs are quiet ones. Not much noise, no guns drawn, no wild rides. Just two people standing still long enough to know they weren't running anymore. And maybe that's what real stories are. Not ones we hear, but ones we stay to live, together. Some stories arrive with thunder, others unfold like sunrise, slow, steady, and impossible to ignore once they begin to warm you. June didn't come to Riverview to be rescued. She came expecting a man and found an empty ranch. She came with a suitcase and found silence. But instead of turning back, she stayed. She planted things that had no reason to grow. She answered doors that weren't knocked on. And when a man finally came down the road, he didn't save her. He simply found a place she'd already saved for herself. Silas didn't return to a woman waiting in shadow. He returned to a woman standing in the light of a life she'd built without him, and still made room for him in it. Maybe you've been June. Maybe you built something out of what someone else left behind. Maybe you've been Silas, trying to come home not to a person, but to the best version of yourself. And maybe, just maybe, you believe, like we do, that love isn't something loud. It's something that shows up every day, in work boots and worn hands and borrowed silence. So tell us, what part of June's journey made you stop and feel? When did Silas earn his place back? And have you ever built a life that someone else could walk into without asking you to move aside? We'd love to hear your story. Drop a comment. Share this with someone who understands quiet love. Because sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones whispered between two people who stayed.